YouTube title: Aphorisms not to inspire you or offer wisdom but only to make you think. Original title: Beyond Argument. Aphorisms on telling and not telling the truth. 1. Today's truth is tomorrow's prejudice. 2. What starts off as a powerful argument often ends up as the power of those who no longer feel the need to argue. 3. Even the simplest things are complicated beyond measure. 4. In politics, one inevitably adopts the policy of thinking the best about one's own side and the worst about the other. 5. People often think about a matter to come up with an opinion on it so they then don't have to think about it. 6. Truth is idealized as something stationary or static, whereas all the evidence, historical, empirical, or otherwise, shows it to be constantly in motion. However, certain elements, moving much more slowly, give the appearance of being fixed. 7. When the claim to truth is also the claim to goodness, to the highest levels of ethics, morality, justice, wisdom, and even holiness, there is this paradoxical and often horrifying result: little tolerance for opposing claims. 8. A thing not fully known, which at bottom is the nature of all things, is open to so many possible interpretations that, when someone says that such and such an interpretation is the correct one and, being the only correct one, therefore a fact, he is surely the hero of the day but the defeated champion of tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. 9. Suppose all thought, even the greatest, amounts to having a prejudice of one kind or another. The only remedy then, it seems, would be to have one prejudice countering another in a repeated, diverse, and wide-ranging way. But this is precisely what goes on in the world. 10. An aphorism wants to be both understood and not understood, understood by the most sensitive ears, not understood by anything less. 11. Just as a poem, an aphorism will probably not mean much unless it comes close to one's own thoughts and sensibilities, in which case it is like a piece of coal turning into a diamond. 12. An aphorism, if it is to have the deepest view or widest outlook, must leave moralizing to others. 13. Few arguments are won by mocking, vilifying, or intimidating those with a different point of view. In the short term, however, it must be effective, because it is done all the time. 14. Insofar as the good changes and contradicts earlier positions, the truth is forced to follow it or else find its own way. 15. One should consider the possibility, however outrageous it may seem, that, morally speaking, we are all at the same level when all elements and circumstances not in our control are factored in. 16. All political struggle has the characteristic of raising the rightness of its position to an untouchable principle. 17. If it is the case that, even in science, there can never be an account that is absolutely complete, that gives the full measure of things, then how much more so for everything that does not quite qualify as science. 18. What is generally considered to be true and generally considered to be good form complex fields of interests and beliefs that, however much they overlap, never quite coincide. 19. It is more truthful to be negative than positive if it is the negative but not the positive that accepts the negative not merely as absence but also as presence. It is more truthful to be negative than positive if it is the negative but not the positive that recognizes the negative as being one, not only inseparable from but also integral to the positive, 2, existentially, ethically, aesthetically, epistemologically, and ontologically active, 3, capable of not only opposing but also subverting the metaphysics of opposites, i.e., being versus non-being, true versus false, good versus bad, and so on, and 4, truthful not only as possibility but also as impossibility. Finally, it is more truthful to be negative than positive if it is the negative but not the positive that embraces everything as if it were but a rack of clouds, with substance enough for us in the here and now but otherwise not in our keeping. 20. Loose talk will always be with us as much as learned discourse insofar as the world forever falls short of being a monastery, a courtroom, a laboratory, and a classroom. 21. The advantage of slogans, simple arguments, and rallying cries is that they influence, motivate, and galvanize people widely and even from one generation to the next. The disadvantage is that they are never an attempt, and here is their great shortcoming, to do justice to the complexity of a situation. As a consequence, they are inevitably challenged over time. It may take more than a generation, and subject to being discarded, modified, or replaced. At the very least, they grow weaker in their effect, often becoming little more than platitudes. 22. If well expressed and not threatening our basic convictions, a point of view different from our own can be, when duly considered, not only tolerable but pleasurable. 23. What is the game of truth? It is the play of truth in the finite, its appearance, presentation, verification, authorization, and codification, while partaking of the infinite where none of these operations have a beginning or end. 24. What is the game of truth? It is the game that forever conjures up the belief in imperishable truths, even though these truths, insofar as they belong to this world, can only be written down on perishable material. In other words, if the parchment is destroyed, these truths are supposed to endure, be it in the mind of God, be it in some other form, be it in a universe that is considered to be, although scientific theory now challenges this, eternal. 25. What is the game of truth? It is the game that, ironically enough, allows systematic error, deception, and falsehood to play their part, so that this much-valued and many-sided activity, vast in its implications, full of plans, projects, programs, quests, discoveries, claims, schemes, and illusions, can go on indefinitely, putting into play all that matters more in the long run: interest, passion, adventure, inspiration, hope, belief, direction, commitment, etc., than final answers. 26. Generally speaking, it is easy to feed a prejudice because there are so many facts to support it among all those that don't but can be conveniently ignored. 27. Having a prejudice is an inescapable principle if having principles is itself a respectable version of the former. 28. To be invisible is not to be unimportant. It is simply to be invisible. 29. Anything can be objectified and therefore objected to. 30. The scholarly ideal is to be an excellent cartographer of other people's thoughts. 31. Reasoning about complicated matters in philosophy is always at fault because it always leaves out some complication. 32. Certain arguments are always able to convince certain people. It is on this basis that vital sustenance is given to all social movements. 33. Arguments are much more useful than aphorisms but, unlike them, tend to date. 34. For the sake of brevity and brio, aphorisms might end up claiming too much. However, it is less frequent in them than arguments because their mission is not the one of turning the unknown into the known, the uncertain into the certain. Rather, it is more the one of guarding the integrity of the unknown and uncertain, of being, in a certain measure, the gadfly of argument. 35. The main objection to arguments is their saying both too little and too much. 36. If we were truly fair in our judgments, we would not make them until all pertinent elements had been weighed and measured. For a host of reasons, however, nothing is less common. This judgment itself, however, should be tempered with another, namely, we need to live with faulty judgments since perfect ones would have to be forever deferred. 37. In any argument, even a philosophical one, winning the argument, in debate, competes with getting to the truth. 38. The best thing to be said about party politics is that it ultimately gets things done, is difficult to replace, is sometimes entertaining, and is probably the most effective way of exposing the divergences from the truth that both sides so earnestly occupy themselves with. 39. Arguing to a conclusion is like running in a race in which the baton is the prize, often not worth passing on. 40. Polemics. How much of our talking time is taken up with it? Especially in politics. Can anyone avoid it, or at least anyone discussing uncertain or controversial issues? Therefore, we are all consigned, at least part of the time, to being less interested in getting to the truth of a matter than scoring a point or winning an argument. 41. Argumentation that goes on in a more or less homogeneous group is peaceful enough. But when it comes to the same between radically different groups, it is more like taking up arms and using them. 42. Until we realize how important winning is to us, we will never grasp the extent to which truthfulness can be put out of play. 43. Two things an aphorism has going for it is not exaggerating what is usually exaggerated and not avoiding what is usually avoided. 44. It is certain an argument can change a person's way of thinking, but also certain other factors play in and become increasingly more important. 45. An aphorism has no agenda other than giving best expression to what is truly thought. 46. What is true and what is good are never perfectly united except in those belief systems betraying this ideal as will to power. 47. Our thoughts and feelings are shaped so much by the day-to-day it is impossible to know what new direction they might take as various aspects of custom and culture. 48. Yes, truth can speak to power but it cannot keep itself separate from it without stopping the conversation. 49. Once one realizes how dependent most people's thinking is on what others think in the group or society to which they belong, it becomes difficult to believe their stances on various matters are not ephemeral. 50. From Newton to Einstein, gravity goes from being an attraction between bodies in space to being space that, along with time, is curved by bodies. In other words, it goes from being a mystery that everyone understands to one that, physicists and mathematicians exempted, no one does. 51. For the birth of an aphorism, one is always counting on a state of mind that, at odd unaccountable moments, has the purity of a prism. Most of the time, it is quite the opposite, either cloudy and confused or else self-absorbed and fatuous. 52. Once one is a public figure, especially one who is admired and respected, it becomes difficult to talk on all issues with the same level of openness and honesty. Apart from the difficulty of admitting ignorance in some area or other, there is also the problem of the idealized image one carries around in public that doesn't easily suffer being tarnished. 53. There is man in all his glorious presumption inventing theories about the beginning and end of stars and the universe, but none about the beginning and end of theories. 54. What is comforting as an eternal prospect is both the cyclical return and the straight line to a new destination. 55. The ideal is not separate from the real but rather impressed upon it, resisting it as well as being resisted by it, dynamic tension, creative impulse, intermittent competition, and cooperation. Pathway to and palette of all emotions and sensibilities. Changing contour of a living landscape in every human head and heart. 56. Being concerned with the true at the expense of the good could be viewed as being cold, uncaring, and even reprehensible. The opposite, on the other hand, could be viewed as being flaccid, vulnerable, and wide open to corruption. 57. The most comprehensive thought is no doubt the most unwieldy and unwelcome. It throws up and throws out all oppositions to the vanishing point. 58. Besides the pharaohs, there was a powerful priesthood in ancient Egypt. Today there are some who view Egyptologists as being more or less the same, scientists who, no less devoted to their professional well-being than to the pursuit of knowledge, presume to have answered a number of fundamental questions in their field. On the other hand, the Egyptologists look down on their critics and those who offer alternative answers as being a ragtag group engaged in pseudoscience. It is certain that both sides are right in their own way, which leaves only time to determine who is right and who is wrong on any particular issue. 59. The danger of being a public figure is one can end up speaking less and less authentically on more and more issues. 60. An aphorism is an act of comprehending as far as possible while not losing sight of one's basic ignorance. 61. Both commending and condemning without restraint usually have little to do with extending understanding but much to do with its limitations. 62. Argumentation is part of pushing back the frontiers of knowledge and understanding. At the same time, it can only do so by running to excess, by claiming too much, by building its tower too high. As a consequence, it is forever requiring inspection, repair, renovation, and, indeed, when not collapsing on its own, demolition. 63. The latest argument presented on a matter has the advantage of posing as the final one. 64. If controversial matters were pots and arguments handles, the first would be covered with the second in all shapes and sizes. 65. An institution can only work on the basis of systematic thought. Here lies the tendency or prejudice, if you will, to consider it the highest form of thought. 66. With systematic thought, we have an engine that can run institutions and society efficiently but also, under certain circumstances, into the ground. 67. Academic, argumentative, or systematic thought often fails to recognize some insight or idea that falls outside its precincts or prescribed areas of investigation. It generally redeems itself, however, by a certain professional realignment or readjustment over time and by the realization that justice can only be done by rectifying this error. 68. One thing Einstein admitted but is not generally recognized is the immense role imagination plays in scientific theories. 69. Yes, knowledge is wonderful, but suppose everything is infinitely complex. Then it is no more than our admittedly impressive way of comprehending the whole of which we are a part but which, as the attempt to comprehend it, is continually being left out. 70. Our latest view or interpretation of the world cannot be dealt with objectively until it is embraced by another. 71. If knowledge were not in some sense oversimplification, it would be like an encyclopedia with more and more articles never requiring updating. 72. Even though science is always simplifying, it does so in such a complex way it gives the impression of complicating things. 73. For the sake of having a view of the whole both accessible to and usable for all, reducing the infinite to the finite is the habitual way of conceptually going, or coping. 74. An argument is all about consistency and control. An aphorism is all about catching some idea on the fly and, if judged good, giving it the best expression. 75. An argument is an aphorism that moves outside its comfort zone and into, one might say, a combat zone. 76. Absolute transparency would mean admitting most of our daily whimsical, non-practical thoughts are, apart from a few real insights, repetitive rubbish. 77. Most people do not stop to think opinions are based not only on knowledge but lack of it and, if they had complete knowledge, they would keep quiet. 78. What we call memory is only the conscious part of something millions of years old. 79. Is the aphorism a line of thought without the courage to become an argument? Yes, to the extent that getting into battles and taking risks is courageous. No, to the extent that, by being a lone voice and not drawing support from a like-minded community, its courage is simply of a different order. 80. An argument is prone to overstating its case because it can often do so without being called out. 81. Stereotypes are often offensive and meant to do harm, but treating them as outrageous falsehoods is the will to do away with them at all cost. 82. Yes, the binary way of thinking, the yes or no or true or false way of construing or constituting reality, is dominant in science. But will anyone claim that discussing current events or the politics of the day is scientific? Why then is there this collective will to treat public matters, even those of a controversial nature, as if their structure and movement were as accessible to the mind as chemical or physical events? What generates this rush to find solid ground that, in the flux of things, can only prove illusory? What if not the heat of the moment, the lack of concern for long-term findings, the unscientific approach to this flux, and the multitude of desires and interests that comprise it? 83. One should not be surprised that many historical events are shrouded in mystery since few events today are clear. 84. Every argument leaves out something or, to say it another way, leaves room for a counter-argument. 85. If you hunger for clarity on an issue, be a partisan. 86. Absolute truths are a hot commodity because all who claim to know them can also claim those who don't are either ignorant or ill-willed. 87. Certain high-profile intellectuals of today play the role of the high priests of yesterday. 88. The world is like an ocean floor full of the most amazing diversity. However, the optics of the moment can mislead us into thinking certain exotic plants and animals are much more populous than they are. 89. Just as certain cognitive and situational factors, not to mention social ones, constitute the importance or relevance of the marginal at certain times, so they render it non-existent at others. 90. The notion of good versus evil is a royal falsehood insofar as, while absolutely necessary in human commerce and communication, it is a gross misrepresentation by being not only the true but also false foundation of the moral and social order. Great literary works as well as our own experience testify to this sleight of hand, which is essentially metaphysics' disdain for the minutiae of life and letting it drop out of sight, by portraying individuals, groups, and organizations as receptors of the most noble and ignoble impulses. 91. The most common way to be untruthful is to be selective in what one speaks truthfully. 92. It is amazing the mind can take in so much while ignoring detail. 93. So much in philosophy is an idealization of the human condition with the emphasis on the good. So much in the daily news, however, gives the impression of constant wrongdoing and systemic injustices. Indeed, the distance between them is so great it appears both are extreme or at fault. Despite this unfortunate state of affairs, there is the counterbalancing or compensating one of a happy hunting ground where they coexist, mutually fructify, and feed off each other. 94. The good-evil dichotomy is the axis upon which action is taken drastically and irrevocably. 95. Trying to persuade others and trying to be objective amount to a conflict of interests only to be minimized. 96. The power of persuasion goes hand in hand with perpetuating the belief one is completely informed about a matter or being completely informed. 97. What is science? Essentially a body of both interlocking and non-interlocking ideas based on and elevated by a rigorous, massive, and ongoing attempt to understand the nature of things. With less admiration and possibly even contempt, it is glorified opinion and sometimes worse. 98. If a brain such as Darwin's can produce the theory of evolution and Einstein's the theory of relativity, then why not imagine every brain, though its owner be consigned to oblivion, making its contribution to the great river of human development, and the great ocean of human understanding. 99. It could be the most subtle avant-garde thought, once popularized, becomes more atavistic than the thought it condemns. 100. What has been written well or thought with care and then put to work in public as projects not always in keeping with care and constraint, what is extraordinary but still flawed to some degree as sources of later thought or mainsprings of later action, is doomed to be altered and adulterated in the forum, the school, and the marketplace, giving rise to the mass production of everything that may be called a falling off and diverting from, which even includes a returning to, some divine or nearly divine revelation. 101. Every time the same facts are interpreted in a different way, a slight alteration occurs in the depiction of the world. This is a subtle or not so subtle process that goes on indefinitely and that, at any particular time, allows for a number of ways to determine reality. 102. The two great poles of attraction in human affairs are change and permanence. In some instances, it is the first that dominates, in others the second. Perhaps the most extensive representatives of these two poles in human thought are science, including technology, and religion, including metaphysics. But the first, dependent on fixed units and parts, is no more absolute change, the parts can only be changed in continuity or discontinuity with other fixed parts, than the second, consigned to dying out and being replaced, permanence. 103. Just as truth is the first casualty of war, so is it the perennial, and daily, one of politics. 104. When it comes to weighing in on, or, for that matter, weighing, matters great and small, we all live in the bubble of the now. 105. Perhaps one explanation for the expansion and longevity of certain beliefs is their having, besides some key narrative and core principles of great range and depth, secondary aspects that may be eliminated, modified, or simply avoided by adherents who, for diverse reasons, are not receptive to them. 106. There are some words used in public and repeated on a regular basis that are clearly intended to make one feel more than think. Perhaps this is not so bad, for people make up a moral and political order that requires emotion to be energized. On the other hand, if ever there were a double-edged sword. 107. The fact that philosophers keep coming back to the question, what is philosophy, shows it is fundamentally the problem of itself, but not in the sense this problem has to be or should be solved, except in the paradoxical sense of its acquiring direction and meaning by trying to do so. No, it is only in the sense there is no final answer to the question of what it is or, for that matter, anything. 108. How difficult for us to realize our interpretation of things is a folding out from ourselves of a worldview already folded in. 109. There is virtually no position in philosophy that, if one looks hard enough, doesn't allow for the discovery of new arguments to prop it up. 110. With the help of technology, 2,500 years of philosophy and numerous philosophical systems have led to a burgeoning truth industry. 111. The greatest, most desired, and most subtle falsehood is the claim that such and such a matter is a simple affair. 112. Truth is idealized as being identical to itself. In practice, however, it wars against falsehood in a way that makes them interpenetrate and overlap. 113. If one were to do a survey of all the positions taken up over the last 200 years on various subjects and in various fields, if one were to take note of all the arguments put forward that support these positions and that seem to be presented in a rigorous, conscientious, and thorough way, then one must surely reach the conclusion that argumentative certainty is one of the most tenacious and inexpugnable illusions we have. 114. The trompe-l'oeil of argumentation is that the latest argument on a matter, seemingly irrefutable, seemingly so in step with the times or, for that matter, all time, cannot be other than the last word on it. 115. Philosophy's eternal predicament is that it must be both highly conservative and highly liberal, highly conservative in its commitment to perpetuating itself, highly liberal in its commitment to challenging and even risking itself. Here there is no question of one being beneficial and the other not. The eternal predicament of philosophy is its condition of possibility. 116. Map all the concern you have for yourself onto others and they should be no more mysterious to you than you are to yourself. 117. An aphorism may sin against itself by exaggerating some point, but usually a big and obvious one, to get its point across. 118. While philosophy, as opposed to science, tends to go around in circles, it has one advantage over the other in that its major texts never go out of date. In short, good reading is there for those who cannot do without it. 119. What is ultimately incompatible but at the same time vital in philosophy are the drive to clarity and the drive to comprehensiveness. 120. The art of argument lies in singling out and outlining the weak or missing points in somebody else's while giving the impression one's own is free of them. 121. To say it again, one can choose the philosophy one finds most suitable, for there are certainly enough of them, and wear it like a shell or a shoe for the rest of one's life. 122. The great philosopher's works are not widely read, but his political views are well known. Since they are compatible with hundreds of thousands if not millions of other people's, he is hailed from all quarters as a man of genius. 123. One advantage of philosophy is that it is a conversation you can return to without worrying too much about where you left off or what you missed while away. 124. When it comes to foreseeing the future, even the best of minds fall short. So much remains unseen as the present steals into the future and slowly lights up its antechambers and vast halls. 125. Interest stands so close to ideals that arguing in defense of the latter is hardly ever innocent or impartial. 126. It is not pure reason but a changing world that makes what was formerly reasonable unreasonable and vice versa. 127. Hypermasculinity, hyperfemininity, and everything that exists or may exist in between is not likely to disappear from the world. Of course, one species or other may dominate for a time, just as it goes with trees in a forest, and may even result in the decimation of others. But just as there is more than one forest, one region, one climate, one country, so there are always instances and possibilities of different outcomes. In point of fact, a world is this drive to diversity, one might even say hyperdiversity, and anything less would be the end of it. 128. The majority of people are good, learned, and wise in a few areas but terribly ignorant in many others. If this were not so, it would be impossible for some political Pied Piper to come along, lead them by the nose, and, in some cases, off the cliff. 129. We are as actors on a stage. Put into different roles, we would learn to speak the lines we thought we never would. 130. If every generation could hear what certain representatives of the preceding ones said, they would know they too thought they could cut through the Gordian knot of morality. 131. There are no pure arguments that change a person's way of thinking. There are only good or effective ones taken up by people already predisposed to having their minds changed. 132. The reason party politics can never be a wholly honest affair is that, first of all, it is a highly competitive game with winning being, if not everything, of great importance. Second, it is largely based on trying to please an immense populace composed of many different groups with conflicting interests. Third, party loyalty often demands following an official line despite whatever disagreement one might have with it. Finally, there are few occasions on which, in this environment, self-criticism isn't toxic. 133. As in the case of causal relations, a thing repeated 1,000 times is taken to be fully known and understood. 134. Upon listening to a learned scholar argue, one cannot help wondering if his tone and manner of delivery, the level of certainty he brings to his subject, misrepresent entirely his situation as well as our own. In other words, does not his professional bearing keep all eyes and ears away from the fact that, as knowledge seekers, we are lantern bearers in rooms that, however well we light them up, will remain forever unknown or obscure to those who come after us in the distant if not so distant future. 135. An argument has an agenda which is good from the point of view of its being timely and useful but not so good from the point of view of its being dogmatic. To be sure, other arguments will come along not only to prevent this registering of conclusions without an equal registering of uncertainty and critique, but also to make sure this argumentative closure is recalibrated. 136. In his Confessions, while expounding upon a considerable number of self-delusions that afflicted him throughout his life, Jean-Jacques Rousseau gives the impression his writing about them is, at least to some extent, an act of self-deception. Stating his objective to be giving an account of his life, in every way true to nature, he falls short in that, while implying an open and transparent account of his actions and character, he leaves out examining the nature of this account itself. In other words, he pays little or no attention to its apologetic and testimonial nature as complicating or contradictory factor, as self-serving and perhaps falsifying interpretation. If such an examination had in fact been undertaken, he might have had to confess he wrote the book mainly to prove his worst actions never sprang from a wicked heart. 137. Take almost anything under the sun and, depending on one's attitude towards it, it can be either dignified or disparaged. 138. In the case of things having worn out and needing to be replaced, the new promise is better. In the case of things not having worn out but the new being desired or demanded simply for its own sake, it comes with the proviso, written in fine print if at all, that there is always some risk of damage in delivery. 139. Broadly speaking, it is not certain that the search for truth is what dominates intellectual discourse. After all, though a dystopian or apocalyptic vision might be as justifiable as a utopian one, it is only the latter that has served as an intellectual beacon throughout the ages. No doubt this has been and always will be the case for reasons that range from the fear of death to the need for a conversation without end. 140. When a scholar criticizes some work or discourse for being more rhetorical than argumentative, one should ask, is this criticism itself an example of being rhetorical? Surely the answer will be yes if he cannot demonstrate where and why the work in question is rhetorical and where and why argumentative. 141. Virtually all discourses and, in particular, formal ones are inflected by the moral sensibilities of the age. Very often this inclination, which can also be viewed as an affectation, takes the form of duly noting some socially approved thought, sentiment, or point of view. Such a way of speaking is particularly evident when an argument is to be made that, in however slight a way, runs counter to prevailing ones. 142. If great works of the past such as the Sphinx and pyramids are mysteries, then how much more so the works of nature? 143. Given there are people more apt to feel than to think, should this not constitute a division that, like old versus young or city versus country, determines values? 144. If there be such a thing as an intolerable truth, it is two-sided or double-vectored, antisocial versus personal, anti-religious versus reverent, anti-conceptual versus thoughtful. If there be such a thing as an intolerable truth, it can be stated plainly as, everything is inseparable from everything else. However, to be understood best, it requires more poetic language. If there be such a thing as an intolerable truth, it is the chant barely heard by humans but reaching their ears as a hymn nonetheless, omnia inseparabilia ab omnibus. Omnia inseparabilia ab omnibus. 145. There seems to be a mixture of stupidity and wisdom in all attempts to grasp the whole. Stupidity from the point of view of considering them futile, wisdom from the point of view of considering them fundamental. 146. Every teaching or doctrine can catch a glimpse of the whole and make some significant claims about it. A partisan or follower cannot stop there, however, since hierarchy and choice must fit into his conception not only in a particular but general way that is wholly inclusive but also exclusive. 147. An aphorism should avoid everyday language on current issues because, often enough, it is riddled with assumptions never recognized as such but, as the arms and ammunition of contending parties, help to generate the fog of war. 148. Take up a position in life and a way of thinking is almost forced on you. 149. Harsh critics can never be entirely just in their fight against injustice or truthful in their fight against falsehood. 150. The will to truth is the will to power insofar as the claim to know it entails the right to act in accordance with it. 151. Inbuilt to all polemics is the willingness to slug it out and even throw mud if necessary. 152. Quick conversation cuts corners. Truth is therefore compromised even by the best of speakers. 153. Sensationalism in science. Yes, even there it can make the difference between succeeding and failing. But woe to those who come up with results neither in tune with the times nor in line with the paradigms. 154. The way we look upon the world, the way we view things in general, including good and evil, is deeply tied up with what we are as persons leading particular lives and thrown into particular situations. The latter, being historical, cultural, social, religious, and political, go a long way in constituting our knowledge, feelings, and identity. 155. Do you see that anthill over there? Do you see how its inhabitants, its residents and citizens, hustle and bustle about? Do you see how hard they protect it and how much they expand and rebuild it? And do you think these creatures don't care about it in some great and mysterious way? And then, to think of what can happen to such anthills, the destruction, the chaos, the colossal upheaval. Is this the ineluctable destiny of so much careful construction? Is this the destiny of all such craftsmanship and art as both natural and human process? 156. Watching the ant, I have the impression it knows what it's doing. By contrast, I really don't know what it is up to. Ergo, the ant is much more knowing and intelligent in its sphere of activity than I am. But to feel this way, I must think of the ant as not being simply part of its environment or, for that matter, mine, but mastering it. 157. It may be that whole societies conjure up bogeymen and fen the fear of them to keep away the thought of the Damoclean sword hanging over their heads. 158. Perhaps the most common or widespread form of foolishness is being certain about what is not. Like all things, however, it cuts both ways and, when all is said and done, perhaps we should be grateful for this vain, fatuous, gullible, irascible element since virtually nothing would ever have gotten done without it. 159. In most cases, information is useful. In some, vital. In others, questionable. In others. 160. Everything great must eventually mix with a certain amount of the mediocre to become popular. 161. One party has a vested interest in exaggerating the importance of some newly discovered facts or ideas for economic, political, or moral reasons. Another has a vested interest in shooting down such facts or ideas because they are in opposition to its line of thinking. On one side, the liberal or revolutionary, on the other, the conservative or institutionalized. Only a complex sorting out over time will tell us where the truth lies or, to put it another way, whether the conservative or institutionalized manages to maintain the status quo, traditional and time-honored values, or whether the liberal or revolutionary can go from being scorned and rejected to vindicated and accepted. 162. Every age acts as if it had just invented a perfect morality and every previous one had been terribly lax in such a matter. 163. Polarization sets in when both sides of a difference or dispute feed to their adherents what they most want to hear as highest concern. 164. Calling one's work scientific to justify one's position or conclusions is not itself scientific but political. 165. The pedagogical and the propagandistic are surely combined in the political arena. Much of what goes down there as thought is more like hitting on the same nail. However, it would be wrong to think this constant repetition has no design or purpose. Rather, it is meant to teach a certain way of thinking to a specific audience or, better, teach the language of this way of thinking, that is, all its idioms, arguments, and so on, so that one ends up with something that barely requires thinking. 166. Until we have learned to start the conversation about our adversaries in a way different from today, there is no reason to think there has been or ever will be a jot of progress in this area. 167. When there is a scandal, the steamroller of public opinion can be so frightening even those only remotely connected to it will feel threatened and find it necessary not only to deny the connection completely, but also hint at mischief or calumny. 168. The nature of morality isn't trying to understand it but decking oneself up in it. 169. Apart from all other considerations, being a dyed-in-the-wool partisan or a person with prejudices is simply the outcome of limited means. Give everyone enough resources in the way of time, energy, intellect, education, and material rewards and see what a sea change there would be. 170. Politicians will never be thoroughly honest in their talk because of their complicity in or proximity to coercive, corrupt, cruel, cowardly, complaisant, and sometimes criminal practices. 171. The political will never be able to bring about a perfect world because its means can never be so pure, its practical course so straight and unerring as to not end up making a mockery of its putative ends. 172. What is called truth at any particular time is that plus an associated dogma. 173. Excessive repetition of anything, rather than reinforcing it, should make us suspicious of it. 174. What is reality? A multitude of perspectives, opinions, beliefs, theories, and so on, with each one claiming with confidence, and sometimes with dead certainty, that it is all but case closed. 175. The present is the reality we most take to heart along with the sense that we matter. 176. The pain that can be inflicted on us up to atrocious levels makes the present moment the nerve center of our universe. 177. Trust should be highest with those who speak with an open mind and heart. All others, with possibly a few exceptions, should be vetted. 178. The problem with the press is not so much it lies, but it takes up one perspective and magnifies it to the point all others, if not entirely hidden, are obscured. 179. The word perverse may be right to describe the media's practice, but so also the expression, based on popular demand. 180. Many who are attracted to a certain position and convinced by the arguments have little patience for anything contradictory or contrary save a bombshell revelation. On the other hand, the latter can shock and titillate to such a degree that even the fiercest opponents will find common ground. 181. Most people agree that certain values, principles, and ideals have, unlike a human life, no expiry date. However, proof of this could only be provided in the form of, short of having divine omniscience, universal agreement on all these values, principles, and ideals as well as related ones. In short, universal agreement on everything. 182. One way to keep a healthy perspective on contentious issues is to imagine first our forebears looking at them, then our descendants. 183. There are innumerable things in this world about which there isn't the least reason to be secretive or deceptive and yet are shrouded in mystery. What chance is there then of getting to the bottom of things routinely covered up or lied about? 184. To think all processes that keep a person alive, biological, psychological, sociological, and so on, would have to be tracked in nanoseconds to give a full account. 185. What truth-teller is not in danger of being compromised if he is forced to keep an eye on the entertainment value of his speech? 186. If truth were what we wanted throughout our lives and on every occasion, it would be apocalyptic. 187. If you would like to have an idea of whether or not you are secure in your beliefs, imagine being before a tribunal of learned judges and, like Martin Luther before the Diet of Worms, made to answer for them on pain of death. 188. What makes large-scale lying so effective is its giving people what they most want to hear. 189. What makes the world perfect, despite or rather because of its imperfections, is its allowing even the perfecters of it to have their day in the sun. 190. He who runs with the crowd runs the risk of losing his head to it. 191. In the media, whatever is different or divergent, for the sake of generating news, may be put under a magnifying glass and, as far as the optics go, move from the marginal to the mainstream. Indeed, the glass is so powerful it causes a certain existential or ontological blip. 192. The great paradox of politics lies in the contrast between its ends and its means. The first speaks of highest things, the second the lowest. While not formally acknowledging the latter as unsavory, duplicitous, or unlawful practices touching their concerns and interests, politicians and powerful groups are almost forced to make some sort of accommodation with them if they wish to hold the road in their affairs, let alone keep on the right track. 193. It is possible that liberal thought has opened itself up so much as to become narrow, that it has made being tolerant in some areas synonymous with being intolerant in others. If this is so, then it has opened up a vital contradiction in itself that makes it a prime target for what perhaps it itself strives to be nowadays, namely, a moral crusade. 194. Propaganda is certainly efficient in one way and perhaps one way alone. It convinces those who uphold only weakly a point of view to join forces with those who uphold it strongly to form a, more or less, solid front. 195. If the objective of learning were to be as fair as possible in one's judgment of a matter, then the whole would never be judged by the part, which of course is the common practice, but rather the part always by the whole, which involves great effort and is therefore rare. 196. The art of journalism in the mainstream media is holding everyone and everything to account in the public arena except itself. 197. Virtue's name can serve self-interest as well as vice and, in this way, become a vice. 198. The hard, perhaps unacceptable truth is that, if this magnificent world were not a horrible place at least to some degree, it would not interest us to the highest degree. 199. Ad hominem arguments and personal attacks should always be considered a sign of weakness. However, given that they are often taken to be the opposite, namely, a sign of strength, and given they are often used by both skilled and unskilled speakers alike, one may ask, what's going on? Why is this the case? The answer must be that, in order to be perceived for what they are, namely, as a sign of weakness, the majority of people would have to be what they are not, namely, full of patience, probity, and wisdom. Often it takes a great amount of time for them to get past old prejudices and be in accord with sound argument and objective findings. 200. When generalizations are treated with the same level of certainty as particular observations, poor reasoning must be somewhere in the mix and being honored or unrecognized until its day of reckoning. 201. Thinking for oneself means being suspicious of all public, popular, and professional opinion, treating the important points of a matter as decided and settled. 202. It may be that deep in the religious psyche, what is felt are a duty and desire not to think. 203. When it comes to analyzing moral problems, it is virtually impossible to do so without merely a semblance of being cold and objective. The reason for this moral charade, as we might very well call it, is as simple to state as it is difficult to formulate into an acceptable principle. The general understanding is that we have both good and evil in the world, that these two are not only distinct but radically opposed, and that, even when carrying on a scientific or philosophical study, to mix or confound the two is not only a mistake but evil itself or close to being so. 204. With its hero on the one side and villain on the other, melodrama has always been one of the most popular forms of narrative. Since the media is in the business of not only informing the public but also selling a product, it employs this form but always with the possibility of doing rewrites to change the heroes and villains. 205. The greatest insight one might have is that nothing has to be exactly the way it is, and that everything and anything can change and even change dramatically. If anyone doubts this, let them think of the countless plant and animal species that have been in this world and of the fact that only the smallest fraction of them are still with us. 206. Replacing arguments with accusations is the quickest way to go for those with an agenda. 207. To think much of what is now considered to be fresh, new, advanced, and groundbreaking will one day be as dated as the sundial or the Ptolemaic model of the universe. But, conversely, assuming what we have created, invented, thought anew, and taken pride in over the last few years or generations will go on forever, will rise every day like a new sun, will contribute to an enduring legacy, to the very structure of being itself, this is our hope, our dream, our commitment, our raison d'etre. 208. Human curiosity spans all limits except those making us weary, uncomfortable, or frightened, and sometimes it even exceeds these. 209. If life weren't nuanced to the nth degree, what need would we have of poetry? 210. No matter what the principle or ideal, if driven to an extreme, it will end up a caricature of itself, both tragic and comic. 211. The great religions have operated and flourished by banning the values of the material world from their liturgies and devotions while smuggling them back in as empire building. As far as many institutions and individuals go, heaven and mammon have always been yoked in practice while divorced in principle. 212. It is certain that 1,000 years from now, if humanity survives, very few people will care about the issues and events we care or claim to care about. This ambiguity itself is telling, except those of the most basic sort. 213. Reasoning of a politician, if it serves the greater good, what do a few lies along the way matter? 214. Truth is highly valued in politics when it makes up a winning hand, but otherwise its value drops, being only held in hand or thrown out. 215. Every simplification is a local possibility but a global impossibility. 216. The will to the greatest good and highest truths are forever collaborating and compromising to avoid obstructing each other. With no less than the ideal at stake, they wish to avoid any appearance of being compromised. 217. Being both a politician and excellent speaker means being able to transition smoothly from truthful to less truthful statements. 218. Politicians are actors who have as their stage the larger one on which they play their parts in a protracted drama with both comic and tragic moments. It is not so much their convincing performances that keep our attention but acting in such a way as to tax us as citizens and would-be or potential actors with the constant threat their actions, when not being the handing out of goodies, will spill over into the audience. 219. Perhaps no political discourse is more frequently dishonest than the one of characterizing the enemy. 220. With respect to the mores of a particular society, especially one of most recent vintage, there is always a gap between the public discourse about them and the way they are received by people in general. It is the lag or play in this area that, along with a multitude of factors, allows things to go down a particular path of development or slow down, stop, and even be reversed. In relation to a variety of conditions and circumstances, these two possibilities can lead to two others, namely, all moral change or development flowing about us like a meandering river or hitting us like a flash flood. 221. There will never be a change in the way we do politics until there is a corresponding change in society. Bringing about this change would mean removing the onus on politicians to tell lies by no longer permitting, promoting, celebrating, and parroting them. However, to speak of such a change is to speak the language of miracle, impossibility, divine intervention or, if on the human scale, systematic elimination of the politically stupid or stubborn. 222. It is common to think we have the appropriate values and sensibilities not only for now but also for all time. 223. When we speak the truth, we can be caught up in things just as easily associated with falsehood, fear, love, hate, ignorance, pride, and so on. 224. Truth is valuable not by virtue of its lasting forever, but by belief in its perdurability. 225. Anything we see in the world that speaks of organization and technology, no matter how vast and complicated, is but an extension of language, animal, vegetable, and mineral. 226. Perhaps the stars talk to one another, but if their talk exceeds ours as much as our talk exceeds the ticking of a clock or the beating of a metronome, what would we know about it? 227. In many instances but particularly in war, trying to find out the truth of a matter and accepting what the authorities have to say about it will likely both drastically complicate matters, existentially speaking, and simplify them, epistemologically speaking, by being a choice between bad consequences and a bad conscience. 228. Life may seem ordinary a good deal of the time, but thought will still never get to the bottom of it. 229. What is language if not humanity's most enduring or longest-running project? 230. So much of what we say or do is groupthink no one escapes. On the other hand, an exceptional action or event, sometimes called genius, breaks us out of it. 231. For a careful thinker and observer, it is always surprising to see how many people are willing to draw conclusions based on limited information and questionable sources. It is almost as if they assumed strength of conviction was enough to settle the matter on the intellectual plane and force the issue on the moral. 232. When not under assignment, the mind is no more in our control than the weather. 233. Were it not for all the foolishness in the world, half of what interests us would be left out. 234. Take the type of person you honor and admire the most, populate the world with him, and you would no longer have a world. For without opposites and everything in between, there would be no evaluations and, without them, no judgment, no discernment, no way of conceiving a world and everything that makes up one. 235. Most people are so busy aligning their thought with others they have no time for their own. 236. At its best, the daily news is a constant effort to give a full disclosure of the partially known. 237. A proven formula for winning over the masses is a highly selective use of information, a show of authority, emotional rhetoric, and frequent repetition. 238. There are many people who would have nothing to say about this or that if they could not praise it to the high heaven or criticize it without mercy. 239. When a scientist or scholar snarls at or viciously attacks some intellectual interloper who enters his field of study and even challenges some of its principles, he is taking an atavistic plunge back not only to his territorially minded ancestors, but also his animal origins. 240. One can avoid being biased in one's comments and opinions by giving equal time and attention to the 2, 3, or 4 sides of a matter. In principle, then, the answer is simple. In practice, it is as difficult as learning 2, 3, or 4 languages. 241. Promulgating an ideal or principle, unlike most ideas, runs the risk of taking it from the very high to the very low. 242. Mediocre minds take their revenge on the great minds of the past by viewing them through the lens of moral superiority. 243. Everything is political, some people say, but if all human effort went into defending some principle or fighting for some cause rather than finding out the truth of a matter, the former would be reduced to being a power without vision, a force without reflection, an effort without endurance or lasting evolution and elevation. Everything is political then only insofar as it regularly yields to the non-political. 244. An aphorism is like a poem in that, if one doesn't like it, one shouldn't argue with it but simply ignore it. But, then again, perhaps this is being disingenuous since, having already recognized the aphorism as a proto or quasi-argument, we should allow for some degree of criticism beyond aesthetics. 245. Due to a lack of time, interest, and energy, most of us will listen many times to the news story we like before turning to another account of the matter. 246. It is well known that recognized experts often disagree. How is it then that so many people make their point as if it were settled science? 247. Perhaps one of the hardest thoughts to wrap one's head around is the idea that all beauty, truth, goodness, love, and so on depend not only on the existence of their opposites but everything that falls short of them. 248. It is a question whether, when some expert claims that this or that is but a myth and not the truth of the matter, he himself is not constructing a myth since he can hardly be in the position of knowing or controlling the fate of it. 249. With a change of word there is a change of thought, subtle or otherwise, which often has the best thoughts playing catch-up to the best words. Conversely, the worst words may end up breaking moral and intellectual ground for the worst thoughts. 250. Radically opposing ideologies become indistinguishable from each other in their righteousness, their combativeness, their hatred of each other, and their will to power. 251. One definition of stupidity, perhaps universal in scope, is thinking one is well informed about a matter, which then proves untrue, then passing this knowledge on as if nothing were more certain than its educational or heuristic value. 252. Sensationalized reporting isn't necessarily unreliable, but it's certainly in danger of becoming so. 253. Finding out the truth of a matter by relying more on ourselves than others is not something most of us can do unless it is a matter of livelihood. 254. How difficult and complicated things are. At least, if one takes the long-term view. A book that sets out to expose a fraud may itself turn out to be one. And whatever sets out to expose the second may itself turn out to be, you see. There is no end to this sort of thing. But to speak to all sides of the matter, there are issues that simply exhaust themselves. What comes to an end are not so much the means and possibilities of pushing a matter further, but rather the matter itself as object of interest. 255. Every creature, great or small, is a world unto itself. Only in this way could there be the immense coordination which constitutes the larger world and which is not perfect, not machine-like, not immaculate being but something greater. 256. Wherever there are questions about what is good for this or that or here or there, best not to expect truth to show up whole and undivided. 257. Rest assured, whenever a particularly divisive issue is discussed and debated in public, a few foolish things will be said which all players will be quick to criticize when they come from the other side. By the same token, a few wise things will be said with the same result. 258. Life is more kind to us than we think, for if it simply bore gifts and glad tidings, if it didn't make heavy demands on us, there would be no story about us worth telling or listening to, except what a god might take interest in. 259. Many people shine in their ignorance because they want to shine despite it. 260. Evil done in the name of good should warn us all of, among other things, its non-critical nature. Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil. What is hypocritical here is the lesser of two evils. 261. Despite everything that can be said against them, lies and deception, which take their most benign form in jokes and stories, will never disappear as long as they can take in dull, mediocre, unimaginative, uninformed, careworn, gullible, insecure, frightened, guilt-stricken, vindictive, or greedy people. 262. When we argue with someone over a controversial issue, it is easy to forget they have come to their conclusions on the basis of knowledge or information not identical to our own. But even if we did take this into account, it would take an effort not to assume, as our default position, their sources being less reliable than our own. 263. He who argues for the eradication of hierarchies must contend with the fact that argument itself is a matter of putting one position above another. Surely then he will have to weaken his argument if there is any chance of strengthening it. 264. Imagine a scholar whose life's work is threatened by some new theory or paradigm. Will he go gentle into the good night? No, he'll likely rage against the dying of the light. 265. When experts who are public figures extend their conversation beyond a certain range of interests, they inevitably go beyond what first qualified them as experts. 266. Few arguments are original and therefore the main concern is learning how to deftly use or refute them. 267. A person who is inclined to the contemplative life cannot put up with the company of others too long, for it tends to get between him and himself. What is a pleasurable distraction for others is for him irksome and tiresome. He does not want to lose himself in the crowd since he already feels a crowd in himself. For better or worse, it is this myriad of elements inhabiting all parts of his psyche that call to him most strongly. 268. The difference between science at the professional level, this might or must be the way it is, and science at the popular one, this is the way it is not without points of convergence. Where the worst of the first and the best of the second come together, or vice versa, is what might be called the promotional and demotional moments of science, insofar as the latter is a public affair with a good or not so good reputation. 269. In order to influence the general public, both politicians and mainstream media count on a large number of people drawing from them as their one source of information. What follows from this is latter-day development, as principle that has been at work in some form or other for thousands of years, as unprofessional behavior and the spreading of misinformation while accusing others of doing so, is the result of a nearly monopolistic control of information being shaken and severely challenged. 270. Corruption in human affairs should come as no surprise because its very nature is to come without warning, incrementally, on cat's paws. 271. Our thinking is forever limited on account of an unknown past and future. 272. There are no final answers outside belief systems. 273. Man is a wolf, said one. Man is a sheep, said another. Man is a wolf in sheep's clothing, said a third. No, man is a sheep in wolf's clothing, said a fourth. A sheep in wolf's clothing, protested the third. What does that mean? Not much, answered the fourth, except that a certain play of words can make it sound as if one said something. So, in fact, insisted the third, you've said nothing. On the contrary, responded the fourth, I think I've said a great deal. 274. If the limitation of philosophy in the university is its being part of the rat race, its distinction is being the most self-questioning part. 275. Without massive diversity that overrides all contrary effects, there would be no equivalent array of opportunities and possibilities arising from interactive elements so great and small as to merge with, being infinitely great or small, the unobservable. 276. How strange to think of the many projects done under the pressure of time now standing before us as unhurried as the pyramids. How strange to think of, perversely enough, a debilitating or downsizing possibility on the spiritual plane with regard to this, namely, one which would have us, while having only briefly stood before a work such as the Great Pyramid, and preferably all alone and at sunrise, suddenly remembering an urgent task to be done or important appointment to be kept. Then, in conjunction with other circumstances hindering a return to the site, we would have to hurry off with the feeling our trip had been wasted and the Great Pyramid's message partly discernible as such. 277. Generally speaking, foolishness is bad but, as diversion, it gets traction. 278. At virtually all levels of political discourse, slandering the enemy is a common practice. What else to conclude then but it is explicitly disapproved of in principle while implicitly approved of otherwise. 279. In politics, when arguments or evidence are not available to be used against an enemy, unsupported accusations are often resorted to. Unjust as they may be, they will be used with the same good conscience that others have when playing a bit rough to win. 280. In most public discourses, what is necessary above all else is to fill the void. Even in the face of morally ambiguous or questionable moments, as opposed to emotional or intellectual lapses, keeping silent as response is the wisdom implicitly ruled out. 281. The grace and beauty of the past is to be with us without demanding any more attention than we care to give it. Its largesse of spirit, if we may call it that, is to remain mute and reserved even while deserving this greater attention, modestly awaiting our interest before revealing its riches. 282. Here is a politician, one of the very few, who always speaks his mind. Consequently, he has had little or no success, never having learned the trick of making open-ended promises or announcing dire threats which, even if they are not always outright lies, still allow deceptive words and practices to flourish, particularly in light of all the surrounding talk about noble aims and intentions. 283. Those who seek salvation in science don't seem to realize it too can become a priesthood. 284. Eternity is the beginning and end of particular things in indivisible procession. 285. If the world is doomed, who will deny that only a good lie will save it? If this question is doomed itself, for it initially stood alone as an aphorism, what may we make of this? Abortive affair, no doubt, and sinning on the side of being economical to the point of falling short in sense. The world is doomed. Only a good lie will save it. No one will deny this. What, how, where, and when? Oh, perhaps it was meant to address only one thing, the saving illusion, the thing that keeps order in society and offers a modicum of safety and security until the very end. Well, now having that out of the way as rough explanation, we can admit that this aphorism has turned out to be more about itself than the world's end. Indeed, we can say it is now about what an aphorism can be or fail to be, a conscious probing of its limits or an unconscious limiting of itself. While the work of argument is not what to expect in an aphorism, neither should it be a shortcut for thinking, the use of a few words and ideas to carry a load of meaning, misrepresenting itself and making it seem as if it enclosed a complexity of ideas and was equal to a well-crafted piece of writing with its various points carefully ordered and considered. So, in order to save itself, this aphorism had to turn against itself, before building itself up. An original or initiating idea that wasn't really flying high was brought down to earth and transformed. What more is there to say about this unusual way of writing an aphorism except that behind its transformation was nothing more than a troubled conscience and the unwillingness to let it go unaddressed. 286. It has been said that, when a person dies, it is equivalent to, subjectively speaking, the end of the world. If such is the case, then lying may very well have the power to, if not eliminate, reduce suffering. Who will deny that a commitment to telling the truth that disallows this would be both cruel and pathological? Cruel to the person not being lied to and pathological in the person incapable of lying. It goes without saying that a person incapable of telling the truth is much more common. Question then, how likely is it that Kant, the most famous representative of the prohibition against lying in the history of Western philosophy, acted or would have acted as one who, in conformity with his teachings, never tells a lie? Answer: as pathological as Kant may have been in the matter of keeping his philosophy consistent, he no doubt acted or would have acted in a way at odds with it. Like most scholars, Kant was no doubt more interested in preserving his professional integrity than being morally pure in the way of a Thoreau or Wittgenstein. 287. Integrity is where everything seems to be in order and what it should be and may not only get the seal of approval, but also the highest respect, but, despite all this, is still searching for what is missing. 288. News reporting is not only the art of sensationalism but also of camouflaging it. 289. So much of the public discourse on contemporary issues, particularly in the media, is like junk food. It is consumed by a majority of people who, with little time on their hands and looking for easy and convenient ways of getting information, are not as disposed as they might otherwise be to looking after their intellectual health. 290. If it is true that the majority of people, leading busy lives, want their news on the run, that is, as concise and uncomplicated as possible, then the media can hardly be blamed for meeting this demand even if, by not doing things as objectively and thoroughly as it could, by not resisting the temptation to capitalize on the situation or, more precisely, the limitations of a large number of people with respect to many things but particularly their time and energy, and, finally, by not having any qualms about merely feigning to keep up the highest standards, it ends up looking like an operation run by scoundrels. 291. Thank God for appearances which domesticate truth and make it livable. 292. Respectable scoundrels, those members of society who do rather well despite or even on account of their deep-seated dishonesty, are so common in politics and other places of power that, with all their talk about changing society and the world for the better, they may very well end up ushering in a modern-day Babylon cleverly billed as the New Jerusalem. 293. First of all, there is the long-standing suspicion about the policies and practices of the people who govern us. At the same time, however, there has been the great counterbalance of a general respect for and belief in institutions such as the press, the schools and universities, the law courts, and the scientific community. But now, what is happening to this great counterbalance? Is it not diminishing before our eyes? And if this is the case, what then stands between us and general disbelief in the integrity of institutions? Perhaps what we have here are the signs of an oncoming catastrophe we do not want to see conveniently obscured by the signs of the ones we think we do. 294. There are writings that cannot fit themselves to the times but must wait for their proper moment. Having turned their back on the present and its endorsement, they have made a bet that, by foregoing prosperity, they will be fit for posterity. 295. Truth-telling performs a multitude of tasks while adhering to a gold standard, its greatest works and representatives, that, like the sun, never fails to assert itself even while permitting a multitude of deviations. 296. From being fully in the shadows as non-issue to fully in the spotlight as major one, how many times have we seen this happen or, rather, not seen it? For once something is in the spotlight and as long as it remains there, it is viewed by a host of people as being something permanent, something untouchable, something on the order of a moral touchstone by which one can judge others and distinguish between good and evil. 297. If all that is undesired and loathed in life lacked interest, it would lose, in a manner of speaking, its one saving grace. 298. Who would want to be cursed with fully knowing the future? Who would not rather have much of the best coming as a surprise and much of the worst with as little worry as possible? 299. What is very difficult, perhaps impossible, is to shine the most penetrating light on where we are most successful. 300. So far as it was astronomical luck that generated life on this planet, so far is it behind our greatest successes. No doubt this luck is so deep and covered over with layers of the cosmological, geological, biological, sociological, historical, and biographical that only an imaginative effort can trace it. But in order to do this, we must put aside current theories about the universe, it is reckoned to be some 14 billion years old, and go to an older conception. With eternity as our reference, we can then imagine billions of years as an instant, reducing the passage from simple planet to world to a vast explosion of wide-ranging ends and effects. 301. Ad hominem arguments are used by those who are interested not in scoring a bullseye in discussion but rather in landing anywhere on the target. To make it a much bigger thing to hit and have these new dimensions as the more or less accepted standard is the target, i.e., what is aimed at. 302. What is a debate? A complicated discussion which cannot take place without its participants ignoring its empty center, its core of uncertainty. 303. More than 90% of what keeps us alive, our bodily processes and a nurturing world, is not our doing. Say what you will against religion, some think it nonsense, others evil, but at least it reminds us of these external and internal forces that greatly exceed us. 304. With sufficient resources brought to bear on it, public opinion can be taken in almost any direction. 305. Besides appealing to emotion, propaganda is a call to reason based on claims presumably so strong as to convince all but fools or miscreants of a great danger requiring immediate action and ruling out unnecessary questions. 306. Just as it seems we desire to be like gods and know all, so it seems heavy curtains have been put both behind and in front of us not only to frustrate and afflict us, but also to arouse our curiosity and creativity to otherwise unattainable levels. 307. The living do not worry about the dead except for those they know or imagine. All the rest are so many black cows on a dark night. 308. Most people who think they have the final word on some matter are simply repeating what they have heard elsewhere and, taking it to be authoritative, gives them the confidence to voice it in public. They then feel justified not only in thinking about the matter uncritically, but also in growing angry should anyone not accept their point of view. 309. Because political conflict often demands a firm stand, a show of resolve, a moral compass, an unequivocal for and against, even the most sophisticated thinkers can forget nuances, subtleties, making distinctions, looking at the whole picture, and sometimes even the best part of their earlier thought. 310. Politics can only be a mixture of honesty and dishonesty because, with so many levels of interaction and areas of agreement and disagreement, so many different matters and issues to contend with, so many people bringing their own issues to the table, one or the other on its own would be like sand in the gears of a giant machine. 311. If reason is the basis of truth, then its not being able to prove itself implies faith as its basis and so. 312. Cruelty is the animal wanting food, the elements exceeding their limits, the justice tipping over into injustice. In the face of these horrific conditions, is it any wonder that all has been recast and simplified as good versus evil? And should this moral dualism, this metaphysics, this human construct be now regarded as a major accomplishment, a major error, or a major falsehood? Or should it be regarded as all three? 313. While it is true the victor writes the history, letting the victim write it won't make it objective but only different. 314. It is the situation of the media nowadays that its success is based on being able to talk about issues and events 24/7. With this economic and sometimes political pressure of having to talk even when there might not be much worth saying, it is small wonder repetition, exaggeration, sensationalism, and alarmism have become ever more prominent features of this industry. The effects on society, both short and long term, are not fully known but are already showing signs of being, dare one say it, something to be alarmed about. 315. Even those partisans or political commentators of great integrity can never be truth-tellers of the highest order. With often a livelihood and much else on the line, their priority is polemics, the winning on the battlefield, the commitment to a line of action, the critical circumventing of themselves. 316. The strange is as much at the heart of us as at the furthest stretches of the universe. 317. Get back to yourself if you want to know the truth of things. After all, there may be some small corner where you will find, however hidden, a doubt, a division, a renegade element, truly in line with what you think. 318. Being bested in an argument doesn't necessarily mean being in the wrong no more than having the right position means being able to argue it. 319. According to Thoreau, the difference between a philosopher and a professor of philosophy is the one lives it and the other teaches it. But the latter is also an official end, as much as this influences his, or her, living or teaching, so too it determines his level of free-spiritedness. 320. When it comes to managing a new situation dangerously out of control, knowledge and experience not wedded to courage and wisdom are a dead letter. 321. Compromising one's principles in the face of changing and adverse circumstances is something to which no one is immune. 322. Every time we sit on the white porcelain throne to be found in every home, we get a sharp reminder of how much the high is tied to the low, the pure to the impure. Crudely put, it's thinking and stinking together. 323. Politicians and mainstream media are masters of the half-truth or quarter-truth that, under normal circumstances, doesn't get much play or doesn't have much effect on society. But if one or more of these everyday lies becomes an important part of raising a general alarm that gets out of hand as false alarm, as some political or popular movement taking a minor or even non-existent threat to be apocalyptic, its potential as harmful event is enormous. 324. Between what we call dead and what we call living, there is a great deal of activity and transmission. A book, for example, carries the past towards the present as much as reading does the reverse. 325. Professional critics rarely if ever engage in self-criticism. To this extent, they fall short of being those who tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. 326. The main difference between an aphorism and an argument is that, while the first is primarily an attempt to tell the truth one knows or thinks one knows, the second is primarily an attempt to tell the truth one thinks others should know. The second is therefore an attempt to win over others, to exercise power, to be useful and active even to the point of risking error by rendering the uncertain certain, the unknown known. 327. Everybody has the tendency to talk about a particular matter as if they were an expert on it if they have heard somebody else talk about it as an expert and believed every word they said. What is forgotten is that there are few subjects on which the experts agree and probably none on which they agree absolutely. Indeed, there are many on which they have completely opposing views. 328. Truthfulness without goodness is cold-hearted calculation, while goodness without truthfulness is passionate wrong-headedness. 329. Both truthfulness without goodness and goodness without truthfulness lead to perdition. 330. The main advantage of the truth over the long term is that it is a prevailing wind hard to resist. 331. When we argue with someone over a matter we think we know well, when we pursue it at length with a person we consider to be no fool but stubborn enough not to fall in line with our way of thinking, we ourselves might play the fool by giving full rein to our presumed mastery of the subject and, as a consequence, finding it also to be one on which we are ignorant. 332. No one has a lock on language which makes it, with its both glacial and lightning ways of doing things, its both macro and micro grasp of the world, its both protean and procustion embrace of everything in it, the lord of the humanly possible. No well-off, self-serving setup or operation can prevent its minor incursions as hostile elements or make its center immune from eventual attack. No political, social, cultural, or philosophical hegemony can maintain itself without both harboring and fighting this ever-evolving worm. 333. The hare is in history as something already past but as something still going on, the tortoise. 334. News and political commentary listened to now will be remembered in later years as background noise while doing something else. 335. Before the assassinations, before the atrocities, before the mass murders and executions, and before the genocides, one thing is necessary: an unrelenting war of propaganda making one group, faction, side, or country think another is finally getting what it deserves. 336. There is a great deal of talk about hate speech nowadays, but very little about its most obvious and dangerous manifestation, the enmity and verbal violence that characterize political discourse. To think it can be eliminated by continuing with a series of limited successes on this or that front, to think it can be extirpated from the human psyche, to think it can be measurably reduced while being generated daily by political differences and disagreements is to be oblivious to its hydra-headed nature, its ability to grow new heads while old ones are being lopped off. 337. The governments of today seem to be no more aware of the great danger they court in polarizing public opinion than the late 19th century governments of Europe were aware of what they were doing as prelude to the First World War. If the second was akin to wiring countries together with volatile explosives of unknown power, then so with the first, except, instead of military alliances posing the hidden threat, it is now cultural corporate political alignments. 338. Perhaps one of the most universal but least recognized of our needs or drives is maintaining a good self-image. In a multitude of ways stretching from the popular to the private and even the perverted, it secretly guides us as we play our often very similar but also very different roles. We are all actors on the world stage with spectators, including ourselves. For the most part, or at least for most of us, it is easy to leave aside the size of the parts we play or the grandeur of the stage we are on. 339. Truth must often play catch-up, but, as a sort of compensation, it can also play hardball. 340. To be a politician almost forces one to become a Pinocchio, high integrity notwithstanding. 341. Having a vision of a better world is all to the credit of those on the left, but if they are willing to use dishonest means to realize it, better they forget it. But of course they won't, and argue, not without reason, the end sometimes justifies the means. 342. We have dishonest media and politicians who many people trust for reasons not so obvious unless it's simply not having the time or inclination to look into them or check them out. 343. Death is total indifference to the goings-on and hubbub of life to a degree that is even deeper than dreaming goes. 344. Let us imagine there is such a thing as sleep without dreams. Could there be then anything but a physiological difference of the most basic sort between it and death? 345. Moving towards the left where utopian schemes flourish allows politicians free rein to make grandiose promises. Today they seem to be about climate change and pandemics. Tomorrow they may be about earthquakes, volcanoes, asteroids, and continental drift. Of course, all of this is ridiculous, but, politically speaking, it makes sense because many people are willing to believe the government has godlike powers. In truth, what these wizards accomplish by getting whole populations to go along with them borders on the superhuman, but in less a divine than diabolic way. 346. Youth is fresh for this world and its functionality, often fitting in better than age. But when it comes to its aberrations, often the handiwork of those with experience and selfish intentions, ignorant and ill-equipped. 347. In human affairs where corruption is common enough, correction is there to save us from ourselves. 348. The future is the power of the past pushing through the present as the relentlessly experimental and unsparing recreating of itself, as the constituting of time either as nearly frozen process or as charged and explosive events, as the force of forces ready to put everything on the line not only for some immeasurably small changes taking forever, but also for spectacular effects that happen in an instant and change everything. 349. If dying were as easy as falling asleep, if it no longer held any horror for us, who would not slip away in a dream or burn up like a moth in a flame? 350. Standing armies are slaughterhouses in the making, if not for one generation then another. There are many means of making them part of an honorable and even glorious profession, but, apart from these long-term practices that effectively divert attention from the end result, what horror haunts these standing armies as a common, almost pedestrian feature of history books, of what is necessary for a people's or nation's protection and even survival, of rules and regulations inscribed in institutions going back to antiquity, can be psychologically distanced and even eliminated by carrying out a series of peacetime military maneuvers and parade square drills, which new recruits thrown into battle sorely miss out on, that play counterpoint to battlefield losses like sailing on smooth seas to shipwrecks. 351. To hold on to power, many or most political leaders are willing to take the occasional mud bath because, if they win most of their battles or do not lose the most important ones, they know they can maintain a sort of scrubbed respectability. 352. Yes, the rule is a powerful thing, but so is the exception when, either highly placed or extraordinarily effective, it leads to the propagation of itself or the extinction of all. 353. It may be that whole peoples, being stricken, must also hit rock bottom before being able to look up. 354. Thank God for the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of yesteryear. For if we had to depend solely on what we get from today, foolishness running to insanity would have already gone by us at warp speed. 355. Certain ideas and events generate interest to such an extent that the conversation about them can go on for generations and eventually transform their character from the morally certain to uncertain. At the same time, there is an ongoing process of return to the former by way of viewing a past good as present wrong or a past wrong as present good. Taken as a whole, the contradictory and convoluted nature of morality seems to get straightened out with this reversal which, undoubtedly responding to certain needs and purposes of the present, must abstain from recognizing the latter's power over the past and willingness to persecute as much as honor it. 356. The day all corruption is gone from politics is the day to believe its pie-in-the-sky promises. 357. Think of all the energy expended in human affairs, be it in times of peace or in times of war, that extends itself to the moment of its virtual non-being, its non-traceability in human affairs. 358. In public affairs, conversation of the most contentious sort lies at the extremes not only in the sense of where to find it but what to expect from it. 359. Aiming at riches and recognition is always but a hair's breadth away from making the sort of compromises that are themselves but a few steps removed from the slightly or sharply descending path of, but, of course, not all becomes corrupt to the bone. 360. During the First World War, Albert Einstein was amazed at the number of eminent scientists, scholars, and statesmen who were willing to jump on the bandwagon of German imperialism. Along with other historical examples of widespread compliance and complicity, this points to the fact that, when the political winds are blowing strongly, few people want them in their faces but on their backs. 361. In controversial and contentious matters, even the best of heads can take a few cheap shots. 3 reasons for this might be: first, no disputant, no matter how brilliant, can have a thorough grasp of every aspect of a subject. Second, where discussion is of a polemical nature, people and positions merely in the proximity of the enemy camp are often lumped in, which, of course, is an injustice. Third, maintaining a certain rhetorical tone and tenor, whether it be self-righteous, indignant, angry, or merely critical, can hardly avoid the convenience and opportunism of clutching at low-hanging fruit from time to time. 362. The dreams we have at night give us an insight into what the world would be like if, first, we were deprived of a few natural laws or logical relations and, second, we still found sufficient meaning to want to get somewhere or to the bottom of a matter. Perhaps this reveals the mind's ability to handle many kinds of reality. 363. Philosophy, which has been around for over 2,000 years and upholds truth as its highest value, has a history full of arguments and counter-arguments, both great and small. Its history is, indeed, essentially these arguments without end. Now, take politics. Does anyone seriously think that, given philosophy's track record, political thought or theory will lead to anything conclusive? Does anyone believe that, whether it be under the auspices of the so-called left or right, political argument will lead to a conclusion which is separate from, if one is lucky, a leap of faith taking us towards values and practices that sustain a people for a certain period of time, or, if one is unlucky, a play of forces that manage to coerce and enthrall a people for, once again, a certain period of time. 364. Technology, optimistically viewed, is what is forever improving the human condition. Pessimistically viewed, it is what is waiting for the next monster to take it over. 365. What if it were true all the greatest benefits to humanity are indissociably linked to its greatest crimes? What if all the greatest empires throughout history, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, French, English, Russian, and so on, bore ample testimony to this terrifying, intolerable, unforgivable, and therefore largely ignored fact? 366. The future, be it near at hand or as distant as can be, is full of those elements or activities that, either coming together or falling apart, either happening as predictable outcomes or operating as secret processes, constitute what we call events great and small, as well as history, development, progress, decline, death, and rebirth. 367. A herd of lies, however overwhelming, will eventually give way to the truth that stands head and shoulders above them. Were it not so, we would have perished long ago. 368. It can always come about that some piece of stupidity upsets and even destroys the most complex, sophisticated, and powerful organization. A sufficiently large rock hurtling through space and hitting this planet would be an example of such obtuseness, albeit at the cosmic level. 369. There is not a project on Earth, no matter how worthy of endorsement, that is not subject to being botched by clumsy hands, weakened by corruption, or, if it is built on lofty ideals and expectations, debased by popular demand. 370. Public opinion so powerful it influences politicians and policy makers is also the steamroller that flattens even professional opinion, its erstwhile critic and corrector. 371. Truth is highly valued but, when it comes to the telling of it, it is as volatile as political and malleable as social. 372. Lying halfway between argument and art, the aphorism is less inclined to try to win someone over, although this may be lurking in the background. 373. The aphorism as quasi-argument avoids confrontation and so, to say it crudely, and even vindicatively, chickens out. Its only redemption is, as quasi-argument, sticking it to itself. 374. When all players become loose with the truth despite the scale of human suffering, it is the result of a number of powerful interests lining up on one side or the other and, being true to their interests, setting the agenda. 375. Perhaps propaganda of one kind or another is necessary if for no other reason than to counter the worst of it. 376. Many issues considered to be of utmost importance today will eventually disappear more forgotten than resolved. 377. The art of politics is telling the truth as much as it is an advantage to do so, telling a lie only when not doing so would be politically damaging or disastrous, and, finally, maneuvering between these two the many times avoiding a firm commitment, keeping an ally, or deceiving an enemy is the main objective. 378. Criticizing without understanding or even attempting to understand is as common as dirt. 379. Where great power is in play and huge sums of money are at stake, evil has a garden from which to produce its most poisonous plant. The tempting, sweet-tasting fruit of this monstrosity, at least for a goodly number of people, is hearing it said from supposedly reliable and authoritative sources that all who are willing to tend this garden and see it prosper are good and all who don't evil. 380. Misinformation at the popular level or anywhere else is a bad thing, but when it comes from those in authority, it can be 10, 100, 1,000, indeed, 1,000,000 times worse. 381. On at least one level, the elites of the world and the majority come together, mediocre thinking in the moral sphere. 382. Both the prison and psychiatric hospital open ever wider their doors when the authorities find new ways to determine who and what are threats to society. 383. Who doubts that, after the Nazis took power in Germany in 1933, honesty and openness in political matters became a highly risky affair? and who doubts this didn't affect virtually all members of society, including many of the most refined and knowledgeable. And, finally, who doubts this lack of truthfulness on a grand scale was not quickly covered over by everyone committing themselves to protecting the nation and its interests. 384. Distractions are a common ploy of those who have weak or no arguments. 385. When a person can do little more than rattle off a series of accusations, when he does so repeatedly with little or no argument, when his language is full of the loathing of others and self-satisfaction from being able to judge and condemn them, if not before others, then at least in his own eyes, it is certain, if he truly believes what he is saying, he has much in himself he would like to see somewhere else. 386. Millions of TV viewers throughout the world today are being fooled into believing they are getting not only information and entertainment on their sets, but also a good education. 387. If one wishes to know what is right or wrong with the world, it is better to listen to a few choice individuals than institutions. While all gross errors and grotesquerie are likely to be avoided by the second, integrity, apart from merely professional concerns, is not their watchword. 388. Most people's expertise runs no further than their own little world. Politicians can take advantage of this by being the bad teachers and false prophets of the larger one. 389. Everyone and no one is an expert on current events. 390. The greatest lies are those that, becoming official, ban, blacklist, imprison, or put to death. 391. Thank God the vast majority of words come into being without politics but only as the perfect fit of sound and sense, the inbuilt poetry of every and everyday language. 392. The present is given to telling lies to itself, the past and future to correcting them. 393. While the present provides a platform for lies and deception, the study of the past and work of the future are one for truth. 394. A consumerist society with the greatest benefits of capitalism and most effective methods of communism constitutes the New World Order, along with a major selling job to convince everybody it is the best of all possible worlds. On the other hand, there is a major selling job to convince everybody this dystopian vision is the product of psychopaths actively putting their plans into effect. 395. On the whole, a person who does not materially benefit from holding a position in public on some important matter but in fact risks personal or professional loss is much more likely to be telling the truth than one who does. 396. Every person has strengths and weaknesses that, if any one of them were universalized, would ruin the world for us. Unidimensionality would only be tolerable if we could view ourselves at the lowest and highest levels as bee or ant-like creatures infiltrating and investigating the multitudinous aspects of being. 397. In times such as these, moral weight and authority must come from the people. If anyone thinks it will come from heads of state or institutions, he will be sadly disappointed. For while it is true moral development and sensibility are no less part of their character than others, it is also true they do not put these attributes into play on a regular basis but rather, for the sake of expediency and self-interest, trim their sails to the prevailing winds. 398. How can there be so much intelligence, refinement, and sophistication in the world and, at the same time, so much stupidity? It seems to be, while the first require the slow, steady, step-by-step development of whole areas of understanding, the second only requires the presumption of being able to arrive at these areas, or at least a few of them, rather quickly, easily, and with popular approval. Morality, politics, and religion are such areas of understanding which engender stupidity in the form of a herd of experts. 399. Perhaps the greatest evil comes from those who, wielding great power, become self-deluded, thinking truth and knowledge spring from them rather than, however capricious it may be, a full-handed, myriad-minded, always conceptually changing or developing, cornucopian-like world. 400. War is legalized mass murder with enough adventure, game, spectacle, and money in it to mitigate its immoral side. Even the worst atrocities generate more heat than light, and virtualize its horror. 401. The dinosaurs lorded it over the planet for ever so long, but then, one day an asteroid hit it and suddenly the rules changed. 402. How far can political lunacy go? Well, in Nazi Germany, a person could be rich, respectable, church-going, highly honored, of exemplary character, and even a war hero, but, if he or she had Jewish grandparents, in mortal danger. 403. In dishonest times, the words of a few friends are worth more than all the official statements in the world. 404. The diversity of this world is so great it even takes in all political, philosophical, moral, economic, and religious projects dedicated to making it the kingdom of the same. 405. Apart from sacred texts, the moral compass of a people are exceptional individuals willing to suffer and perhaps even die for some principle or ideal. But if these individuals, becoming part of an organization or institution, go astray, they automatically pass on to kindred spirits what is absolutely necessary for justice to prevail, namely, that sensitive instrument of the soul so different from sacred texts in that it must constantly recalibrate itself according to changing circumstances and events. 406. When those in authority call for monitoring or shutting down certain news outlets or sources of information, it is almost certain they want not so much to stop misinformation as to have a monopoly on it. 407. Totalitarianism is a political movement that ends up being a mass movement by using fear as a both strategic and tactical weapon. It is the most ironic, irrational, and even cancerous manifestation of the end justifies the means principle in that, even when its ends are no longer clearly in sight or its means partially dysfunctional, it can still grow or move along with considerable speed and energy. What it is best at is social control that, because the latter degrades the quality of life over time, cannot help but lead to its dissolution. 408. If everything taken together is complicated beyond measure, then so anything separate. Only our limited perception prevents it from revealing its infinitely fine-grained continuity with everything else. 409. Political correctness is particularly popular among politicians when their incompetence or corrupt practices are showing. 410. What political correctness, institutionalized and officially sanctioned practices and matters of faith, offers politicians and mainstream media is a seemingly unassailable position which is also a default position with respect to discussing the major issues and events of the day. No matter how complicated these may be, the parties in question can always resort to bringing up a few choice issues or items that, apart from all other ones, suggest they have the best interests of humanity at heart. 411. If those discussing a contentious or controversial matter are not willing to hear out and consider opposing points of view, there is no honesty, no debate, no diplomacy, no attempt to stop a war. 412. Paradise is a reality, a lived experience, a world we already have and enjoy, but only in a counterintuitive and deeper conception of the matter, which is to say, as a world already paradisiacal or, more properly, paradisiacal enough not only to allow this thought to come into being, but also to perpetuate itself over the ages despite our having to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Any other possibility, on the human scale at least, would be no better than a beautiful plastic garden. 413. Should the politicians of today, paving the way for the great successes of the future, for the happiness and well-being of the generations to come, and, indeed, even for the salvation of the planet itself, should they not be forgiven if they sometimes fail to address current problems? Or if they do not always seem to be honest? Or if they sometimes show an interest in accumulating power? Well, millions upon millions of people will no doubt answer this question with a resounding yes. These people have no reason, in other words, to think that politicians will let things get truly out of hand or that, for example, they will let debt destroy the world economy or nuclear weapons the world itself. Heavens, if one looks at the 20th century, one must agree that, apart from a few cataclysmic events, politicians ushered in an era of relative peace and stability. All the evidence is there, in other words, for the millions upon millions of people who believe that politicians will get it right in the 21st century and that even a few world-shaking events, even ones that might turn out to be as catastrophic as the ones just mentioned, will not block the way to the promised land so often referred to in the speeches of our modern-day prophets. 414. One good thing to be said about the truth is its regularly bringing about a welcome respite from deception. 415. It may be that one of the reasons huge numbers of people follow the authorities without asking too many questions is simply economic in nature. Whatever is saved in mental labor, whatever is avoided in the way of straining one's brain over complicated and difficult matters, would no doubt be a very welcome thing if, of course, it did not come at too high a price. All of this may very well be a sort of popular wisdom that works well most of the time when there is good governance and only a few slip-ups. However, when a different situation emerges, when things are not so removed from what might be rightly called evil, this insouciance with respect to what the authorities are up to and the way they conduct themselves can come at a huge cost and take on the dimensions of the greatest foolishness. 416. All that is hyperdiversity in this world, especially in the form of animal and plant life, is testimony to the limitless diversity of what is called the same and, indeed, must be called the same, despite this limitless diversity, given what would be required otherwise, namely, divine omniscience. 417. In an argument one is always overstepping oneself and in an aphorism trying not to. But, then again, this, trying not to, is equivocal enough to erode confidence in this aphorism and its claim. 418. Arguments in general take in as much energy, detail, precision, and relevance as is necessary to persuade others. Aphorisms, on the other hand, aim for a higher sort of integrity which has less to do with intention than attitude or approach. It can be understood as the myriad-minded one as opposed to the single-minded. Taking in all aspects of the human condition, not letting any of them drop out of sight for the sake of convenience or out of fear of consequences, and never failing to hold up the mirror to the aphoristic nature and style itself, all this is their way of escaping moral and metaphysical constraints, as much as possible, of not concealing the dogmatic and uncertain nature of things. 419. Both morally and epistemologically speaking, the argumentative tends to view the aphoristic as being not only errant but also outrageous, as speaking its truth as if it were God's own while announcing the death of God as truth. There is truth here insofar as, with respect to the moral dimension, the ego itself is involved but, of course, this pertains to all who call themselves thinkers or philosophers. More importantly, the shortfall in the above criticism is the equivocal, as if, which prevents claiming the aphorist is guilty of a performative contradiction in the form of a God who announces his own death. In truth, all that can be maintained is that the aphorist differs from other truth-tellers not so much by adopting a God-like stance or, for that matter, by not recognizing truth per se, but rather by worshipping the God of truth in a different way or, rather, by worshipping beyond the one bearing all the signs of a human construct. Hence the inevitable equivocation to be found in argument or aphorism comes to the aphorist not on the smallest but largest scale, not hidden in a dense text but openly admitted. The difference can be restated as the possibility of truth announcing its impossibility, which is not logical, self-contradictory, non-philosophical, being itself restated as the possibility of truth announcing its impossibility. Whether or not the scare quotes are adequate to the task of signifying positive effects negated enough to bring about new but also unpredictable ones with new but also unpredictable lines of development, whether or not they also signify what might be called a godlike, hubristic approach pushing reason beyond itself, beyond conception, beyond even cooperation, agreement, and congeniality, this puny effort must be made, before passing away, for reasons as mysterious as life itself. 420. It is so much the nature of arguments to aim for certainty that equivocation, if not falsehood, must inhabit them as unsuspected factor, as blind spot, as needle in the haystack, center or axis. In the Meditations, René Descartes' natural light functions thus by doing double duty as both what renders God's existence certain, as clear and distinct idea, and what exists as part of God's creation. 421. Given that light-heartedness, friendliness, and flexibility will often achieve what hard-headedness and criticism won't, there is nothing to be said against them if they're not at the expense of one's character. 422. A significant though understated difference between human beings and animals is the first's being discreet to the point of obsession about certain bodily functions. In fact, one of these is so abhorred in public that two things may be said about it. First, as well as being kept away from other people's eyes and ears as much as possible, it is also kept away from their noses. Second, apart from medical treatises, clinical talk, a few literary works, and the most coarse and demeaning humor, references to it are virtually nil. 423. Many if not most people work hard most of the time but otherwise go on a mental holiday. Ask them about such and such a country or such and such a historical figure and they likely won't know. The majority of people are therefore experts in some areas but ignorant in most others. It is unlikely they will admit this, however, if they follow the daily news. 424. For the sake of having courage and inspiration in dishonest times, we subscribe to the following maxim: the truth is like a citadel that, though it be often laid siege to or racked by mist and storm, awaits the clearing day when, in peaceful repose, it reminds us all of its enduring strength and stability. 425. It should be borne in mind that corporate decisions are not necessarily the result of collective knowledge and wisdom, although this might be operating at some level, but perhaps one person's will simply being forced on others. 426. The opinions of others form a powerful mirror that not only reflects but shapes us. 427. We habitually pass judgment on the faults of others that are often simply bad habits we don't have. At the same time, we tend to be rather tolerant of the bad habits we do have. In so doing, we end up with another bad habit and level of insouciance that, all things considered, forms our largely unconscious, hypocritical character. 428. The betrayal of science can easily be recognized as the scientific claim to having everything settled. 429. Anyone who thinks the present age is everything and past ages of no great concern is surely not one who, whether he be a historian or not, cannot live without experiencing a life much longer, and greater, than a biological or biographical one. 430. Dying is being forced to abandon the strongest habit we have. 431. There are perhaps social ills so widespread and deep-rooted the only cure for them is catastrophe. 432. If there were to be more fairness in the world, each and every one of us would have to cast a more critical eye on ourselves. 433. One day the aphorist heard himself saying, "Well, maybe you've explored this subject better than anyone else and come to a higher level of truth. But the world will confront you with its own eyes, critical or, if not critical, unseeing or not wanting to see or not interested in seeing. Flip a coin that has prosperity written on one side and posterity on the other. On which side do you want it to land? On both sides? Despite knowing what it means to take on the whole crowd, you persist in imagining them to be crowning you with laurel." 434. Honesty is the best policy except in politics. 435. How bizarre these people are who abuse others but set themselves up as judges. How bizarre then so many or, rather, all of us. 436. What? You say you believe everything you hear on TV about this matter because so many experts are in agreement about it. Well, there are many points to consider, but let me raise just one. There have been times in the past, cf. slavery, colonialism, eugenics, anti-Semitism, where experts or so-called experts were in agreement about things. However, if they expressed their views today, we all know where they would be. 437. The near future is certainly visible to us as something to be planned for and perhaps dimly imagined, but the distant future with its lack of content, its lack of precise and comprehensive knowledge, is as hidden from us as the far side of the moon or, perhaps better, the center of the sun. 438. We tend to think of the future with ourselves as part of it, which partially explains our short-sightedness with regard to it. 439. The pressing issues of today will one day have gone, but our closeness to them now prevents us from seeing this. 440. Long-term predictions about the state of the world will always suffer from an overestimation of the present's power to include the future by perpetuating itself as the past. Conversely, they will suffer from an underestimation of the present's power to be the future even before it is past. 441. What is important for the future is as much what is unobservable as present future as what is observable as past present. 442. Just as bad decisions cast in bronze can lead to disaster, so good ones put on ice. 443. The great trick on the moral scene today is to magnify relatively distant threats or minor social injustices to the exclusion of much nearer or greater ones. The victims of war and poverty, for example, get short shrift because money and power see no possibility of building in their precincts the facade of a social conscience. 444. In politics, there are only two policies which perdure: winning at all costs and the end justifies the means. 445. Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus, what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence. True, one might say, as tautology or mystery, but has this ever prevented anyone from talking about what they don't know? Has it not in fact incited everyone throughout all time, be they theorists, mythmakers, or commentators, to do more, much more, than simply put in their 2 cents? 446. There are few heroes if what is understood as heroism is the willingness to risk much and perhaps all. 447. It is a hateful thing to say, and perhaps only to be said in an aphorism, but without the most frequent, widespread, and hateful affliction humanity knows, there would be hardly any history. 448. Few there are who, having to choose between losing their livelihood and living a lie, will opt for the former as the lesser of 2 evils. 449. The Achilles heel of eminence, achievement, and reputation is forgetting one's humble origins, for, ultimately, everyone has these, and being co-opted by power. 450. An aphorism should only take in as much detail, precision, information, and so on as to persuade the aphorist. His concern about being in the right outweighs his desire to persuade others about it. 451. The habitual lying of politicians and the media would not be possible without the huge appetite for false stories and related items of interest. 452. Working in the criminal system means having to deal with what a lot of poor souls have done in their worst moments. 453. How many are those who, leading decent lives, are awake to everything in them but asleep to everything else? 454. We cannot do without comrades and kin even if it is only ghosts who fill these roles. 455. If one wants to know the truth of a matter, it is always better to look to those with the highest integrity than to well-oiled corporations, vested interests, or people simply used to getting their palms greased. 456. A complex situation still evolving is precisely where the charlatan or fool, but perhaps also the paid commentator, gives the impression he has it all worked out. 457. We are all actors on the world stage with roles that are more or less determined and with scripts that only vary with the scenes we are in. It goes without saying that some are better than others. It is a sort of iron law that constitutes our social lives and, without which, we would recognize neither ourselves nor others. 458. We all know we are animals, but who, since the dawn of civilization, has taken this to heart except those who were stark raving mad and then some. 459. After the need to take the next breath and a few other vital functions, feeling right about oneself becomes physiologically important. 460. Every great philosopher creates a monument of thought that, if one takes into consideration all the critics and commentators who come to it later, has the aspect of both an impregnable castle and a house of cards. 461. Just as almost any idea, custom, principle, or tradition, no matter how well established or long-lasting, can be challenged and perhaps done away with in the name of truth, so can it also be subverted in the name of good, however superficial or self-serving this may be. 462. The thought that can never go public, or at least in the biggest way, is that evil is necessary for good, but the latter, in order to be what it is, must forever deny this even to the point of doing its own mischief. 463. To be fair, it should be said that care and concern go straight to the top of modern-day society as much as cruelty and corruption. As well, it should be pointed out that simple indifference plays its part as a sort of middle ground that cuts a large swath in human affairs. However, the latter is not always easy to determine as both collective and individual mindset. Think of going through customs at the airport or dealing with family members at a funeral. Nor is it always in sync with the sort of good feelings and everyday idealism that generates trust and confidence in others. As a consequence, this built-in insouciance, this systematic, machine-like, and even inhuman side of things, doesn't bear more than casual scrutiny except in a treatise or work of art. 464. Hearing about the life and death issues of the past will put to sleep a significant number of people who, if they suddenly had to face similar issues, would react monstrously. So many sluggish imaginations being kick-started by events, so many stone-cold engines suddenly being revved up and frightfully overheated, so many thoughts propelled from petty concerns and puerile indifference to panic mode, so much changing before the eyes and becoming grotesque as breakdown of control and civilized behavior, so much, in other words, that escapes being called non-monstrous. 465. If certain crises function as the great correctors of collective stupidity, then the worst, like flood to fertile soil, is tied to the best. 466. Party politics is an ongoing blame game that cannot be taken seriously as representing the human condition without leading to the conclusion that its essential nature is moral degeneracy. 467. Astronomically, cosmologically, or eschatologically speaking, all humanity is living on a razor's edge. 468. Morality becomes immorality when, in its fight to assert itself, it is willing to pick up any weapon at hand. 469. The great optical illusion is seeing the present as a defining moment for the fate of humanity more important than all others. 470. Lying is lord of the short term, truth the long. 471. In the area of politics, morality, and religion, being lied to does not bother an enormous number of people until it brings bad consequences. 472. It is possible to integrate popular nonsense almost seamlessly into the tried and true for a while. 473. In truth, everything new runs the risk of being a bad deal when, as news or information, it is also false advertising. 474. What danger is there in thinking too deeply about life if it is essentially endless miracle and mystery? 475. If we put aside all thought of war and what it entails for humanity, it seems to be our essentially social character, including the little recognized friendly and gracious treatment of strangers, that has kept us going for thousands if not tens of thousands of years. 476. Is it possible to buy into some royal falsehood and yet be scrupulously honest in one's day-to-day affairs? Of course, since every large-scale certainty is this falsehood. 477. All who stand on a matter as if they had absolute knowledge of it, with further questions being unnecessary, irrelevant, or even immoral, are, whether they know it or not, taking a holiday from hard thinking or else in full retirement, possibly as ones who had once been its adepts and practitioners. 478. Truth always stands between the already known and still to be known as the transitory state of the fully known. 479. Morality doesn't progress in the world without backtracking, without one day finding itself in need of a good shake-up or major reset. 480. When a person passes away, he leaves behind a story that, however indeterminate in the making, or imprecise in the telling, allows him to take on flesh and blood and, in this way, live again. 481. We are highly influenced by our surroundings. Take a look at heavy traffic. If we ourselves are in the midst of it, we feel we too should be in a hurry, if we're not tourists, to get somewhere. Now take a look at the clouds. If we focus our attention on them, nothing seems to matter but sailing majestically above everything else, impervious to all distractions below and as woundless as the wind. 482. If the dead can leave their tombs, we should judge them more wisely than has hitherto been the case. We should view them as actors, who having taken off their costumes and makeup and left behind their roles on the stage as heroes, villains, lovers, haters, great ones, little ones, etc., who having then returned to what may be called the greater stage they came from, escape all censure for having ended up on the smaller one to make a living, their being successful or not of no greater importance than who or what role they played. 483. Perhaps the only way to get through life without wrongdoing is to be fortunate enough to have it cut short. But of course, to say such an outrageous thing means having in sight the strictest morality. 484. Uncertainty to the point of worry and anxiety, and predictability to the point of boredom and depression, these two are the Scylla and Charybdis of many a life. 485. If there were an ideal way of being for humanity that dominated above everything else and had no serious competitors, it would have to be sleep or death. Only in this realm could the idea of heaven have a chance of being realized and all spiritual life, and not just the highest, be rewarded. 486. It is hard to win friends and influence people while being honest to the point of hardness. 487. It is harder to keep friends than win them when it is not the false word of the friend that matters most but rather the one that one is oneself afraid to utter and that balances between being a kind act or courteous gesture and the slight betrayal of one's principles that, rightly or wrongly, is felt to be the sacrifice of one's self as best friend. 488. The cooperative element, vital to all society, leads to the exploitative element, vital to all life, being fully suppressed in theory and partially in practice. 489. The aphorism as way of thought ends where anger, argument, and action begin. Its life is the peaceful contemplation of what has been, what is, or what might be. Its death is the apocalyptic war or event that, as one great and final epigram or epitaph, ends all. 490. According to scientists, natural catastrophes on a global scale have occurred more than once and wiped out nearly all life on this planet. Such a prehistory, covering an immense span of time, suggests both a certain precariousness and a certain perdurability. While all life can be threatened at any time, the planet itself seems to have a good chance of surviving and even exploding with life after it's being nearly decimated. Now, given this state of affairs and the current threats of nuclear arms and global warming, wouldn't it be advisable to be more modest even in one's political thinking? Wouldn't it be the right thing, given that existential threats of a global nature will be with us for generations to come, to avoid making serious matters sound like a cosmic joke? In other words, instead of making save the planet the rallying cry of future generations, wouldn't it be advisable to have something less presumptuous and more authentic? Something that doesn't overstate our capacity to control the future and at the same time, doesn't try to mask our primarily egocentric concerns. Finally, something that would reach deep into our whole history and not simply speak idly about our modern-day role. Help us to save us from ourselves, whatever powers may be, and forgive us our trespasses, especially those against all other living creatures. 491. When we, the whole of humanity, that is, find some way of proceeding that goes beyond the one of routinely thinking, morally, politically, and culturally speaking, the best of ourselves and the worst of our enemies, there will be the coming of some practice, principle, or passion into the world almost divine as a human possibility. Needless to say, it will have to do what has never been done before, subvert all forms of the will to power. High or low, weak or strong, justified or not, all manifestations of this drive must become the opposite of our virtue. In this way, all strife will end if not all struggle, as the sun sets on our tumultuous spiritual life.